Emma Chen's hands trembled as she signed the contract that would change everything, the pen scratching across paper like a death sentence or a lifeline. She couldn't tell which anymore. And across the mahogany desk sat the lawyer, with eyes like flint, who'd found her in the hospital cafeteria 3 days ago when she was counting coins for coffee after another 16-hour shift, watching her mother fade from stage 4 cancer that was eating through their savings faster than the disease ate through her mom's body. Hey, beautiful souls. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you're watching from. Maybe you're curled up in bed or taking a break from your own struggles. And I just want to say thank you for being here. Because this story, Emma's story, it's about the kind of desperate choices we make when love and money collide in the most dangerous ways. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button now because you're going to want to see how this impossible situation unfolds. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I love connecting with you all. The contract stated she would marry Victor Moretti, heir to the most feared crime family on the East Coast, live with him for exactly 1 year in his fortress of a mansion, and in return, she'd receive $100 million, enough to save her mother and never worry about money again. But the lawyer's next words made her blood freeze. When he said, Victor lost his sight 2 years ago in the assassination attempt that killed his father, and he hasn't left his estate since. Hasn't trusted anyone. Hasn't let anyone close enough to even try. Emma looked at the black and white photo of Victor taken before the attack and saw a man who commanded rooms with just his presence. Dark eyes that could strip away lies, a jaw carved from marble, and shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. But the lawyer said that man died the night the bullets flew, and now Victor Moretti was a ghost, haunting his own mansion, consumed by rage and paranoia, surrounded by guards who watched his every move, because the family feared he'd become a liability in his darkness. She asked why they chose her, a nobody nurse from Queens with student debt, and a dying mother, and the lawyer smiled without warmth, and said Victor's grandmother Lucia had very specific requirements. The bride needed to be educated, desperate enough to agree, but moral enough to keep the secret. And most importantly, she needed to have medical knowledge, because Lumia believed the right woman could bring her grandson back from the abyss he'd fallen into, could make him want to fight again, want to see again, want to live again. The money would be paid in full after 1 year, regardless of whether the marriage was consummated or dissolved. But there was a catch that made Emma's stomach drop. If she broke the contract early, or revealed the arrangement to anyone outside the family, she'd get nothing, and her mother's medical bills would be called in immediately by the Moretti-owned hospital, where she was currently receiving treatment, a detail Emma hadn't known until that moment when she realized these people had already woven themselves into every corner of her life. She thought about her mother's face that morning, the way she'd tried to smile through the pain and told Emma to stop worrying, to go live her life, to find love and happiness instead of watching her die by inches in that sterile room that smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. And Emma knew her mother would never approve of this devil's bargain, but she also knew her mother would never get the chance to disapprove if Emma didn't sign. The lawyer pushed the pen closer and said Victor was expecting her tonight. The wedding would be a private civil ceremony in the mansion, with only family present, and then she'd move into the East Wing where Victor had been isolating himself since the attack. And Emma realized she was about to enter a world where money and power moved in shadows, where a blind man still controlled an empire through fear and loyalty, where she'd be sleeping under the same roof as someone who'd probably ordered deaths before breakfast. She signed her name Emma Chen, soon to be Emma Moretti, and felt the weight of that decision settle into her bones like lead. Felt the last threads of her normal life snap away as the lawyer gathered the papers and made a phone call in rapid Italian that she couldn't follow. And within an hour she was in a black car with tinted windows, driving through gates that closed behind her like a prison, up a driveway lined with armed men who watched her with dead eyes, toward a mansion that looked more like a fortress with its stone walls and narrow windows that reflected the dying sunlight like knife blades. The car stopped, and a woman emerged from the front doors. Elderly, but moving with the grace of someone who'd never bowed to anyone. Silver hair pulled back severe, wearing all black like she was in permanent mourning. And Emma knew without being told this was Lucia Moretti, the grandmother who'd orchestrated this entire arrangement, who'd bought Emma like a prescription medication for her broken grandson. And when their eyes met, Emma saw something that terrified her more than the guards, or the contract, or the mysterious blind man waiting somewhere in that fortress. She saw hope, desperate, clinging in hope that Emma Chen was the cure for a darkness that had nothing to do with Victor's eyes and everything to do with his shattered soul. And Emma wondered what happened when you failed to heal a man who'd forgotten how to feel anything but rage. Lucia Moretti didn't offer her hand or a smile. Just studied Emma like she was evaluating livestock at auction before saying in accented English that the ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. And Emma should know that Victor didn't want this marriage, didn't want a wife, didn't want anyone in his space. But what Victor wanted stopped mattering the day he decided to rot in darkness instead of leading his family. And Emma felt a chill run down her spine, realizing she wasn't just marrying into this family. She was being weaponized against a man who'd already lost everything. Lucia led her through marble hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men who all had Victor's jawline and that same aura of controlled violence. Past rooms filled with antique furniture worth more than Emma's entire apartment building. And Emma's nursing scrubs felt like rags in this palace of old money and older blood. But she forced her spine straight because she'd spent 3 years dealing with entitled doctors and dying patients and grieving families. And if she could hold her composure while a man flatlined in her arms, she could damn well hold it while walking through a mansion. They entered a bedroom suite bigger than Emma's entire apartment, and Lucia gestured to a wedding dress hanging on the door. Simple white silk that probably cost more than a car, and said Emma had 20 minutes to make herself presentable, because the Moretti family didn't do shabby even for contract marriages. Then she paused at the door, and her voice softened just slightly when she said Emma reminded her of herself 50 years ago. Another girl who married into this family out of necessity and found something she didn't expect. But then the softness vanished, and Lucia warned that Victor's cousin Antonio would be at the ceremony, and he'd been managing family business since Victor's retreat. And Antonio didn't want Victor to recover, because a blind recluse was much easier to control than the ruthless leader Victor used to be. Emma changed into the dress with shaking hands and stared at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. And she thought about her mother, who'd raised her alone after her father walked out when Emma was 6. Her mother who worked 3 jobs to put Emma through nursing school. Her mother who never complained even when the cancer diagnosis came and the medical bills started piling up like accusations of failure. And Emma's deepest fear wasn't that this marriage would be hell. It was that she'd become the kind of person who could sell herself and call it love. That she'd look in the mirror one day and see her father's cowardice staring back. A knock interrupted her spiral, and a young woman entered, maybe 25, with kind eyes and nervous energy, introducing herself as Sophia Corleone, Lucia's assistant and the closest thing to a friend Emma would find in this house. And Sophia helped adjust Emma's dress while whispering rabid warnings about family dynamics. How Antonio had 2 brothers named Luca and Paolo who followed his lead like attack dogs. How Victor's personal guard was a man named James Ryan, who'd taken a bullet for Victor during the assassination and blamed himself for not preventing Victor's blindness. How the household staff were loyal to Lucia, but terrified of Victor's unpredictable rages that came without warning. Sophia said she'd been working for the family for 3 years, since her own father owed them a debt, and she'd seen Victor before and after the attack. seen him transform from a man who commanded respect through intelligence and strategic brilliance into someone who commanded fear through isolation and paranoia. And Sophia's voice dropped to barely a whisper when she said sometimes late at night she heard him screaming in his wing, heard things breaking, heard James trying to calm him down, and she wondered if Emma knew what she was really walking into. Because this wasn't just about money. This was about trying to reach someone who'd barricaded himself behind walls of rage and grief. Emma wanted to ask more, but Lucia returned with a priest who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and they walked to a private chapel where Antonio stood with his brothers, all three men wearing expensive suits and expressions that made Emma's nursing instincts scream danger. The same look she'd seen on family members who were already planning how to spend an inheritance before the patient died. Antonio stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said how delighted he was to welcome Emma to the family, how Victor was so lucky to have found such a dedicated wife, and the way he emphasized dedicated made it sound like an insult, like he knew exactly what this marriage was, and found it amusing that Emma thought she could make a difference. Then the chapel doors opened, and James Ryan entered, pushing a wheelchair. And Emma's breath caught because there was Victor Moretti, and even sitting down, even with dark glasses covering his eyes, even with 2 years of isolation carved into the hard lines of his face, he was the most devastatingly beautiful and broken thing she'd ever seen. And when James positioned the wheelchair at the altar, Victor's jaw clenched, and he said in a voice like gravel and silk that they should get this farce over with because he had better things to do than play dress-up for his grandmother's delusions. And Emma realized her deepest desire wasn't just to save her mother, it was to prove she was strong enough to save them both. This stranger who didn't want saving, and herself from becoming someone who gave up on people just because they'd given up on themselves. The priest's voice droned through the vows like he was reading a grocery list, and Emma stood beside Victor's wheelchair, feeling the weight of every eye in the chapel, Antonio's amused smirk, Lucia's desperate hope, Sophia's worried glance from the back row, but it was Victor's complete stillness that unnerved her most. The way he sat like a statue carved from ice and rage. And when the priest asked if he took Emma to be his lawfully wedded wife, Victor was silent for so long that Antonio actually laughed and said maybe the groom needed time to think about it. Victor's head turned toward his cousin with predatory precision, despite the dark glasses hiding his eyes, and he said in a voice that could cut glass that he was thinking about how easy it would be to have Antonio's tongue removed for speaking out of turn. Then he turned back to the priest and said he supposed he took this woman whose face he'd never see and whose motives he'd never trust. And Emma felt something crack in her chest at the bitterness dripping from every word. But she said her own vows clearly because her mother didn't raise a quitter, even when she was marrying a man who hated her before knowing her name. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, and said Victor could kiss his bride. And the silence that followed was so thick, Emma could taste it, could feel Antonio's anticipation of Victor's refusal, could sense Lucia's fear that this whole plan would crumble before it started. But then Victor reached up and removed his dark glasses, and Emma gasped, because his eyes were the color of storm clouds, beautiful and unseeing, and fixed somewhere past her left shoulder. And he said, if they were going to play this game, they'd play it right. Then his hand found her face with surprising gentleness, and he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, wasn't sweet, wasn't anything like a wedding kiss should be. It was possession and anger, and something desperate underneath that made Emma's knees weak. Made her forget they had an audience. Made her kiss him back with a fierceness that surprised them both. And when they broke apart, Victor's expression was shocked, like he'd felt something he didn't expect. And Emma realized with terrifying clarity that this broken, dangerous man could destroy her in ways that had nothing to do with money or contracts. James wheeled Victor out immediately after the ceremony, and Antonio approached Emma with that same predatory smile, saying he hoped she enjoyed her wedding night alone, because Victor hadn't let anyone into his private quarters in 2 years, not even the cleaning staff, and he lived like an animal in there, breaking things and refusing help. But Emma should feel free to enjoy the East Wing's amenities and the generous allowance Lucia would provide. And maybe if she was lucky, Victor would acknowledge her existence before the year was up. Emma excused herself and followed the direction James had taken Victor, ignoring Sophia's whispered warning that Victor's wing was off limits, and she found herself in a corridor that grew darker and more isolated, past the last of the ornate decorations into a section that felt abandoned, and at the end was a heavy door with James standing guard, looking surprised and concerned when he saw her. James said in a gentle Irish accent that she shouldn't be here, that Victor needed space, that the wedding had already pushed him past his limits. But Emma said she was Victor's wife now, and she wanted to see where her husband lived. And something in her tone made James study her differently, made him see past the desperate bride to the nurse who'd spent years dealing with difficult patients. And he stepped aside with a warning that Victor threw things when he was angry, and she should duck. Emma opened the door to what should have been a luxurious suite, but looked like a war zone. Furniture overturned, curtains ripped down, broken glass glittering on marble floors. And in the center of the chaos sat Victor in his wheelchair with his head in his hands. And, when he heard the door, he snarled for James to leave him alone. But Emma said it wasn't James. Victor's head snapped up, and he demanded to know what she was doing there. Said their deal didn't include her playing concerned wife in private. Said she should go enjoy her new wealth and leave him to his darkness. But Emma walked carefully through the broken glass and said she'd made a deal to live with him for a year, and she took her commitment seriously, even if he didn't. And Victor laughed without humor and said she had no idea what she'd signed up for, no idea what he was capable of, no idea that the man she just married was responsible for things that would make her run screaming. Emma knelt in front of his wheelchair, close enough to see the scars on his temples from the attack, close enough to smell whiskey and rage. And she said her mother was dying of cancer, and she'd watched her waste away for 18 months, watched her scream in pain, watched her beg for death. So whatever darkness Victor thought he had didn't scare her because she'd already lived through hell. Victor reached out fast as a snake and grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising, and he pulled her close and said the difference was her mother's suffering would end. But his never would. He'd live in this darkness forever. And then his other hand found her face. And he said the worst part was he'd never see if she was lying when she inevitably betrayed him, like everyone else. And Emma felt his thumb trace her cheekbone and realized he was memorizing her face the only way he could, through touch. And she understood with sudden devastating clarity that Victor's blindness wasn't the prison. His inability to trust was. And she'd just become the warden of a man who'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Victor released Emma's wrist and wheeled himself away from her, his movements jerky with barely controlled fury. And he said she could stay in his wing if she insisted on this charade. But she'd follow his rules. No touching things without permission. No trying to clean or organize. No pitying looks he couldn't see but could definitely feel. And most importantly, no pretending this was anything more than a business transaction that would end the moment their year was up. Emma stood slowly, her wrist throbbing where his fingers had gripped, and she said she'd agreed to his rules. If he agreed to hers, she needed access to the kitchen at any hour, because she worked night shifts at the hospital and her schedule was irregular. She needed to video call her mother daily, and he needed to stop throwing things because she wasn't going to spend a year dodging broken glass. And Victor's laugh was sharp and bitter when he said she had nerve-making demands in his house. But fine, they had a deal. The first week was a cold war of silence and avoidance. Emma left for her hospital shifts and returned to find Victor's door closed, and James standing guard looking apologetic. She heard Victor moving around at night, heard him navigate his rooms with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every inch of his prison, heard him on phone calls conducting business in Italian, with a voice so commanding she forgot he couldn't see the people he was ordering around. Sophia brought meals that Victor refused to eat, and Emma started leaving food outside his door. Simple things like the pasta her mother used to make. And she noticed the plates came back empty, even though Victor never acknowledged the gesture, never said thank you, never admitted he needed anything from anyone. On the 8th night, Emma came home from a brutal shift where she'd lost a patient, a kid barely 20 with his whole life ahead of him, and she found herself standing outside Victor's door at 3 in the morning with tears streaming down her face. And before she could stop herself, she knocked and said she knew he didn't want company, but she couldn't be alone right now. The door opened, and James looked concerned, but Victor's voice came from inside saying to let her in, and Emma entered to find Victor sitting by the window in darkness, and he said he could hear her crying from down the hall, and asked what happened. And something about the way he asked, direct and without false sympathy, made Emma tell him everything. About the kid who reminded her of her younger self, about the feeling of helplessness when the machines flatlined, about the fear that she was failing everyone, including her mother, including him. Victor was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the night he lost his sight, he'd thought his life was over, thought he'd rather die than live in darkness. But his grandmother told him something that stuck. She said, suffering either breaks you or teaches you how much you can survive. And he'd spent 2 years trying to break. But here he was, still breathing, still fighting, still leading his family, even if he did it from the shadows. Emma moved closer and asked if he ever wished he'd died that night instead of his father. And Victor's jaw clenched, and he said every single day his father was the good one, the one who tried to legitimize the family business, the one who believed in honor and loyalty, while Victor was just the weapon his father pointed at problems. And now the weapon was broken and useless, and Antonia was circling like a vulture waiting to take everything. She sat beside him without asking permission and said he wasn't useless. She'd heard him on those phone calls, heard the way people still feared and respected him, heard the way he commanded loyalty through sheer force of will. And Victor turned toward her voice and said she didn't understand. Antonia was making moves. Small things that seemed innocent, but Victor could feel the power shifting, could sense his cousin building alliances and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And without his sight, Victor couldn't read faces, couldn't catch the subtle betrayals, couldn't protect himself the way he used to. Emma asked why he didn't tell Lucia, and Victor said his grandmother was 83 and had already buried a husband and a son. He wouldn't burden her with his paranoia, especially when he had no proof, just instinct and the feeling of walls closing in. And Emma realized this was why Lucia had orchestrated the marriage. She'd sensed the danger too, and thought a wife might give Victor a reason to fight back, might give him eyes he could trust. The next morning, Emma woke to find Victor in the kitchen, James hovering nervously nearby, and Victor was attempting to make coffee with the kind of concentration she'd seen surgeons use during operations, his hands moving carefully over the machine. And when he sensed her presence, he said, if she was going to live here, she might as well make herself useful and tell him if he was about to pour coffee on the counter. Emma guided his hand to the cup, and their fingers touched, and neither pulled away. And she said she had an idea. What if she became his eyes not just in the house, but in the family? She could attend meetings, watch Antonio, report back on the things Victor couldn't see. And Victor said that would make her a target, would put her in danger she didn't sign up for. But Emma said she'd already signed up for a year in this house, and she'd rather spend it doing something useful than hiding in her room. And Victor's hand tightened on hers, and he said she was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and Emma said maybe both. And for the first time since the wedding, Victor smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his face from beautiful and broken to devastating. And Emma felt her heart do something dangerous in her chest, felt the line between contract and reality start to blur, and she wondered if falling for a blind mafia boss who trusted no one was the smartest thing she'd ever done, or the biggest mistake of her life. But when Victor asked if she really meant it, if she'd really be his eyes, she said yes without hesitation and sealed both their fates. Emma spent 3 weeks attending family meetings as Victor's proxy, sitting beside Antonio and his brothers while they discussed shipping routes and territory disputes. And she'd learned to watch faces the way Victor had taught her over late-night coffee sessions. Learned that Luca touched his ring when he lied, and Paolo's left eye twitched when he was nervous. Learned that Antonio smiled brightest when he was planning something cruel. She reported everything to Victor, who listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. And somewhere between the debriefings and the accidental touches and the way he'd started waiting up for her after her hospital shifts, Emma had stopped pretending this was just a contract and started falling for a man who still didn't trust her completely, but was trying. On a Thursday night, Emma came home early from the hospital because her shift had been cancelled, and she heard voices coming from Victor's study, Antonio's smooth tone and Victor's controlled responses. And she pressed herself against the wall outside the door because something in Antonio's voice made her nursing instinct scream danger. Antonio was saying he'd received an interesting phone call from a journalist named Marcus Webb, who was writing an exposé on the Moretti family. And this journalist claimed he had evidence that Victor had ordered the hit on his own father 2 years ago, had arranged the assassination to take control of the family empire, and the blindness was just cosmic justice for patricide. Emma's blood ran cold, and she heard Victor's chair scrape back, heard the deadly quiet in his voice when he said that was an interesting fiction, and asked what Antonio wanted. And Antonio laughed and said he wanted nothing except to warn his dear cousin that this journalist had proof, had witnesses, had bank records showing payments Victor made to the shooter, and unless Victor stepped down and let Antonio manage the family officially, this information would go public and destroy everything their father built. Victor said Antonio could go to hell and take his fabricated evidence with him, and Antonio's voice turned sharp when he said the evidence wasn't fabricated. He'd made sure of that, had spent 2 years building a perfect case that would stand up in any court. And even if Victor was innocent, the scandal alone would tear the family apart. So he had 72 hours to decide between his pride and his family's survival. Emma heard Antonio leave, and she burst into the study to find Victor standing by his desk, with his hands braced on the surface, his whole body shaking with rage. And she said she'd heard everything, and asked if it was true. Did he really kill his father? Victor's head snapped toward her voice, and he said in a voice like broken glass that, of course he didn't. His father was the only person who'd ever believed Victor could be more than just muscle and violence. The only person who'd seen past the monster everyone else saw. And the night of the assassination, Victor had been the target. His father had pushed him out of the way and taken the bullets meant for Victor's heart. Emma moved closer and asked why Antonio would fabricate evidence. And Victor said because Antonio had always been jealous, had always wanted to lead. But their father chose Victor as successor, and now with Victor blind and vulnerable, Antonio saw his chance to take everything. And the worst part was Victor couldn't prove his innocence because he couldn't see the evidence, couldn't read the documents, couldn't look witnesses in the eye and know if they were lying. She took his hands and said he had her eyes now. She'd investigate. She'd find the truth. And Victor pulled her close and said she didn't understand the danger. If Antonio was willing to frame him for murder, then Antonio wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in his way, including her. And Emma said she'd survived her father abandoning her, and her mother dying slowly and marrying a stranger. She could survive Antonio Moretti. Victor's hands came up to frame her face, and he said she was either the bravest woman he'd ever met, or the most foolish. And Emma said she'd already told him it was both. And then Victor kissed her like he was drowning, And she was air. Kissed her with a desperation that made her forget they were supposed to be pretending. And when they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and said he was falling for her. And he didn't know how to stop, didn't know how to protect her from the darkness that came with loving him. Emma said she didn't want him to stop, and she didn't need protection, she needed the truth. And she asked, who else knew about the assassination? Who else was there that night? And Victor said James had been there, had taken a bullet trying to shield them both. And there was one other witness, a security guard named Thomas Chen, who disappeared the day after giving his statement to police. And Victor had always wondered why Thomas ran, unless someone had threatened him. She said she'd find Thomas and get his real statement, and Victor said Antonio would be watching her now, would know she'd overheard. And Emma said good. Let him watch. Let him think she was just a desperate wife defending her husband. And she'd use his underestimation against him the same way she'd use every sexist doctor's underestimation against them at the hospital. Victor pulled her into his arms properly for the first time and said she was magnificent and terrifying, and he didn't deserve her. And Emma said he was right. He didn't deserve her, but she was staying anyway, and somewhere between the kiss and the confession and the conspiracy unraveling around them, Emma realized the game had changed completely. This wasn't about saving her mother anymore, or fulfilling a contract. This was about saving the man she loved from a cousin who'd destroy everything to get power. And the stakes had just become life and death for them both. Emma spent 4 days tracking down Thomas Chen, using every contact she had from her years working emergency rooms, calling in favors from social workers and patient advocates who knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. And she finally got a lead that Thomas was working under an assumed name at a warehouse in Newark. But when she arrived at the address with James driving and watching her back, she found Thomas's apartment empty, except for a note that said, "Stop looking, or you'll end up like me," and a photograph of Thomas's daughter at her school playground. Emma's hands shook holding that photograph, because it meant Antonio knew she was investigating, knew exactly what she was doing, and was willing to threaten children to keep his secrets buried. And when she got back to the estate, Victor was waiting in the foyer with Lucia beside him, and his face was carved from stone. Lucia said in her quiet, authoritative voice that Antonio had called an emergency family meeting and presented his evidence to the entire council, bank statements and witness testimonies and security footage that had been expertly doctored, and the family had voted. They wanted Victor to step down temporarily while an independent investigation was conducted, and if he refused, they would assume his guilt and remove him by force. Victor said he wouldn't step down and he wouldn't run, and Lucia's voice cracked when she said then they would come for him tonight. Antonio had already positioned his men around the estate, and she couldn't protect him anymore because half the family believed he'd killed his own father, and the other half were too afraid of Antonio to stand against him. Emma said they'd fight. They'd expose Antonio's lies, but Victor turned toward her voice and said it was over. He'd lost, and the only thing left was to make sure she survived this. And he told James to take Emma and disappear, to use the emergency funds Victor had set aside, to get her somewhere Antonio would never find her. Emma said she wasn't leaving him, and Victor's voice turned harsh when he said she didn't have a choice. Their marriage was a contract, and the contract was void. She'd fulfilled her end by trying to help him, and now he was releasing her from any obligation. And he wanted her gone before Antonio's men arrived, because he couldn't bear the thought of her getting hurt because of his failures. She grabbed his face and made him focus on her voice, and said she loved him. She wasn't leaving. They'd find another way, but Victor pulled away like she'd burned him, and said love was a luxury he couldn't afford, and she was a fool for feeling it. He'd used her as his eyes and his shield, and now he was setting her free before she paid the price for his mistakes. Lucia touched Emma's arm and said Victor was right. Antonio would use her against him, would hurt her to break Victor completely, and the kindest thing Emma could do was leave and let Victor face this alone. the way he'd faced everything alone since the night he lost his sight. Emma felt something shatter in her chest, and she said fine. If Victor wanted her gone, she'd go. But he was a coward for pushing away the one person who actually gave a damn about him, and she walked out with James following, and tears streaming down her face. And she heard Victor's roar of anguish and the sound of something expensive breaking. But she didn't turn back. James drove her to a safe house in Queens and said he'd stay with her until this was over. And Emma spent 3 days in that tiny apartment watching news reports about the Moretti family crisis and Victor's alleged patricide, watching Antonio give interviews looking somber and concerned about his cousin's mental state, watching the empire Victor's father built crumble under the weight of lies. On the 4th morning, Emma's phone rang, and it was Sophia crying so hard she could barely speak, saying Antonio's men had come for Victor in the night. There'd been gunfire and chaos, and when it was over, Victor was gone, just gone. And there was blood in his study, and James's phone was going straight to voicemail. And Lucia had collapsed from the stress and was in the hospital. Emma's world tilted sideways, and she asked if Victor was dead, and Sophia said she didn't know. Nobody knew. Antonio was saying Victor had escaped and was on the run. But there was so much blood, and Emma hung up and told James they were going back. But when she turned around, James was pointing a gun at her with tears in his eyes. James said he was sorry, so sorry. But Antonio had his sister and her kids, had threatened to kill them all if James didn't cooperate. And he'd been feeding Antonio information for months, had told him about Emma's investigation, had led Antonio's men right to Victor, and now Antonio wanted Emma brought in as leverage in case Victor really had survived. Emma felt betrayal cut deeper than any knife, and she asked how James could do this, how he could betray the man who'd trusted him for years. And James said through his tears that Victor would understand. Family came first, always. And Antonio had promised his sister would be safe if James delivered Emma, and he was begging her not to fight, not to make this harder than it already was. Emma realized with devastating clarity that she was alone. Victor was missing or dead. The one ally she trusted had been working for Antonio all along, and she had no proof, no weapons, no way to fight back against a man who'd orchestrated the perfect coup. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Emma felt true despair settle into her bones, felt the hopelessness of loving a man she might never see again, felt the weight of failure crushing her because she'd promised to be Victor's eyes, and instead she'd been blind to the betrayal right beside her. And as James apologized again and made her put her hands behind her back, Emma wondered if this was how Victor had felt the night he lost everything, surrounded by darkness with no way out, and no one left to trust. Emma sat in the back of James's car with her hands zip-tied, watching the city blur past, and her mind was racing through every self-defense technique she'd learned in nursing school, every story Victor had told her about surviving impossible situations, every moment of strength her mother had shown facing death with grace. And she realized that being underestimated had always been her greatest weapon. Everyone always assumed the nurse was helpless. The contract wife was disposable. The woman was weak. James kept apologizing, and Emma said quietly that she understood. Family came first, and she asked about his sister's kids. What were their names? How old were they? And James relaxed slightly and started talking about his nephew who loved soccer and his niece who wanted to be a doctor. And Emma filed away every detail because information was power and she needed every advantage she could get. They pulled up to a warehouse in Brooklyn, and James helped her out of the car almost gently. And Emma stumbled deliberately and fell against him, and in that moment of contact, she felt his phone in his jacket pocket and the gun at his hip, and she filed that away too. Antonio was waiting inside, surrounded by 6 armed men, and he looked at Emma like she was a chess piece he'd just captured, and he said it was unfortunate she'd gotten involved. He'd actually liked her spirit, but Victor had made her a liability the moment he'd fallen in love with her, and now she'd serve as the perfect motivation for Victor to sign over everything and disappear forever, assuming Victor was still alive after last night's events. Emma's heart lurched, and she asked where Victor was, and Antonio smiled and said that was the beautiful part. He genuinely didn't know. Victor had somehow escaped despite being blind and outnumbered, had vanished into the city like a ghost. But Antonio had Emma now, and Victor would come for her eventually because love made even the strongest men predictable and stupid. Emma said Victor wouldn't come. Their marriage was fake, just a contract, and Antonio laughed and said he'd seen the security footage from the estate, had watched Victor kiss her like she was oxygen, had heard the reports from his spies about how Victor waited up for her after hospital shifts, and smiled when he heard her voice. And that kind of devotion couldn't be faked even by a man as controlled as Victor Moretti. Antonio told his men to lock Emma in the back office and keep her comfortable. She was valuable merchandise now, and as they led her away, Emma caught James's eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry about your sister," and saw guilt flash across his face. The office had a small window and a desk and a locked door, and Emma spent an hour testing every possible escape route before she heard shouting from the warehouse floor and then gunfire. Sharp cracks that made her dive under the desk, and she heard Antonio screaming orders and men running and more gunfire, and then sudden silence. The door burst open and Emma prepared to fight, but it was Victor standing there with blood on his shirt and a gun in his hand, and James behind him looking shell-shocked. And Victor said, "Emma," in a voice raw with relief, and she ran to him, and he caught her and held her so tight she could barely breathe. Victor said he was sorry, so sorry for pushing her away. He'd been terrified Antonio would use her against him, and he'd thought sending her away would keep her safe. But the moment Sophia called and said Emma had been taken, Victor had realized that living without her was worse than any danger they'd faced together. And he'd spent 3 days tracking Antonio's movements and planning this rescue, with the few family members who still believed in his innocence. Emma asked how he'd found her when he couldn't see, and Victor said he'd always been able to find her. He'd memorized the sound of her heartbeat, and the scent of her perfume, and the way she breathed when she was scared. And James had finally broken and called him with the location, because James's sister had escaped Antonio's men with help from Lucia, who'd recovered enough to coordinate a counter-operation. James said he was sorry. He'd been a coward. He'd betrayed everything Victor stood for. And Victor said they'd talk about consequences later, but right now they needed to move because Antonio had escaped in the chaos and would regroup quickly. Emma said they needed to end this permanently. Needed proof of Antonio's crimes, and she told Victor about the photograph of Thomas Chen's daughter, about how Antonio had been threatening families to maintain his conspiracy, and Victor went very still and said that was it. That was how they'd win, because if Antonio had been threatening Thomas, then Thomas would testify if they could guarantee his family's safety. And Victor knew people who could provide that protection, people outside the family who owed him favors from before the blindness. Emma said they needed to move fast, and Victor took her hand and said they'd move together. No more separation, no more pushing each other away for protection. They were stronger united than they'd ever be apart. And Emma realized this was the moment everything changed. This was when they stopped being two people trying to survive alone and became partners in every sense of the word. Victor told James to contact Thomas through back channels and offer witness protection in exchange for testimony. And James nodded and pulled out his phone, and Victor turned to Emma and said he loved her, had loved her since the night she'd stood up to him about the contract terms, had loved her through every moment of fear and doubt. And he was done pretending this was anything less than real. Emma kissed him and tasted blood and hope and determination, and she said she loved him too, and they were going to destroy Antonio together. We're going to take back everything he'd stolen, And for the first time since this nightmare began, Emma felt hope burning bright in her chest. Felt the certainty that they could win because they had something Antonio would never understand. They had love and trust and the kind of partnership that made them unbreakable. And as they walked out of that warehouse together with James following and the sunrise breaking over Brooklyn, Emma knew the final battle was coming, but they'd face it side by side, and that made all the difference. Thomas Chen agreed to testify within 12 hours of James's call, and Victor arranged protection through a federal contact who had been investigating the Moretti family's legitimate businesses for years and jumped at the chance to bring down Antonio for murder and conspiracy. They scheduled an emergency family council meeting at the estate with every major member present because Victor wanted this done publicly. Wanted Antonio exposed in front of everyone who had doubted him. Emma spent the morning before the meeting helping Victor prepare, reviewing every piece of evidence they had gathered, every witness statement, every financial record that proved Antonio had been embezzling from family businesses for years to fund his coup. Victor was calmer than she had ever seen him, focused and determined, like he had finally found solid ground after months of drowning. He ran his fingers over the braille documents James had prepared, memorizing every detail, and Emma watched him transform from the broken man she had married into the leader he was always meant to be. Antonio arrived at the estate with his own security detail, looking confident and smug, and he made a show of embracing Lucia, who had recovered enough to attend. He told the assembled family members that this meeting was a formality. Victor had clearly lost his grip on reality, and the kindest thing they could do was remove him peacefully before he hurt himself or others. Several family members nodded in agreement, and Emma felt her stomach twist with anxiety. But Victor squeezed her hand and whispered that patience was a weapon sharper than any knife. Victor stood at the head of the table with Emma beside him and said he had evidence that would prove his innocence and Antonio's guilt. Antonio laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the conference room, and said what evidence could a blind man possibly gather? But his laugh died when the conference room doors opened and Thomas Chen walked in flanked by federal agents. Thomas looked terrified, but determined, his hands shaking as he approached the table. He said he was sorry. Sorry for lying, sorry for hiding, but Antonio had threatened his daughter, and he had had no choice. Antonio's face went pale, and he started to stand, but the federal agents moved closer, and he sank back into his chair. Thomas took a deep breath and told the truth. He had been in the study the night of the murder, had witnessed Antonio arguing with Victor's father about the embezzlement, had seen the old man's face turn red with rage as he threatened to disinherit Antonio and expose him to the family. He described how Antonio had grabbed the antique letter opener from the desk, how his uncle had turned his back dismissively, and how Antonio had struck in a moment of pure fury and panic. Thomas had watched in horror as Antonio stabbed his own uncle, then carefully staged the scene to implicate Victor, wiping his prints and placing the weapon in Victor's unconscious hand. The room erupted in chaos, family members shouting questions and accusations. Antonio lunged across the table for Thomas, but Victor moved faster than anyone expected, his hand shooting out to catch Antonio's wrist with perfect precision. Emma realized Victor had been tracking Antonio's position by sound the entire time, had known exactly where he was in the room, had been listening to his breathing and the creak of his chair. Antonio snarled that Thomas was lying, that Victor had orchestrated this entire performance, that a desperate man would say anything for protection. But then Lucia stood, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She said she had suspected Antonio for months, had been conducting her own investigation because she could not believe her grandson was capable of murder. She produced a tablet and played security footage from the night of the murder, footage that showed Antonio entering the study alone at 11:47 p.m. and leaving at 12:03 a.m. with blood on his hands and shirt, footage he had thought was erased, but that Lucia had recovered through a private security firm. Antonio's confident mask shattered. He looked around the room at family members who were staring at him with horror and disgust, at cousins who had supported his claim to leadership now backing away from him. He said they could not prove anything. His lawyers would destroy their case. It was circumstantial evidence at best. The federal agent stepped forward and said they had more than enough for murder charges, conspiracy, embezzlement, witness intimidation, and Antonio Moretti was under arrest. 2 agents moved toward Antonio with handcuffs, and that was when he made his final desperate move. Antonio pulled a gun from his jacket with lightning speed and grabbed Emma, pressing the barrel to her temple and backing toward the door. The room froze. He said he would kill her if anyone tried to stop him. He would take Victor's precious wife and disappear, and Victor would spend the rest of his blind existence knowing he had failed to protect her. Emma felt the cold metal against her skin and heard Victor say Antonio's name in a voice like death itself, low and controlled, and absolutely terrifying. Antonio laughed and said Victor could not do anything, could not even see where to aim if he had a weapon, was helpless and broken just like he had always been. Victor said quietly that he did not need to see. He just needed to listen. He pulled a gun from his own jacket, and Emma saw his head tilt slightly, tracking the sound of Antonio's breathing, the rustle of his clothing, the slight shuffle of his feet. Antonio pressed the gun harder against Emma's temple and said Victor would not risk it. One wrong shot, and Emma would die. But Victor's hand was steady, his expression calm, and he said Antonio had already lost. Had lost the moment he chose power over family, violence over honor. Victor fired. The first shot went wide deliberately, a warning that made Antonio flinch. In that split second of distraction, Victor adjusted and fired twice more in rapid succession. Emma felt Antonio jerk behind her as bullets struck his shoulder and his gun hand, and the weapon fell away from her head, clattering to the marble floor. She stumbled forward into Victor's arms as Antonio collapsed screaming, blood spreading across his expensive suit. The federal agents swarmed Antonio immediately, kicking his gun away and applying pressure to his wounds while reading him his rights. Antonio screamed threats and curses, said Victor would pay for this. The family would never accept a blind cripple as their leader, but no one was listening anymore. The family council voted unanimously to restore Victor as head of the family and to cooperate fully with law enforcement to clean up Antonio's corruption. Lucia embraced Victor and said his father would be proud that he had shown more strength and honor in 6 months than Antonio had in his entire life. Sophia cried and hugged Emma and said she had never doubted them. And James stood awkwardly to the side until Victor called him over and said James had made a mistake. But he had also made it right. And there would be consequences, but also forgiveness, because family meant second chances. Emma and Victor stood together in the study where this nightmare had begun. And Victor said it was over. Really over. Antonio would spend the rest of his life in prison, and the family was safe, and they could finally breathe. Emma said she could not believe he had shot Antonio while blind, could not believe the precision, and Victor smiled and said he had been practicing every day since the wedding, had refused to be helpless, had learned to navigate the world through sound and touch and instinct, because he had known eventually he would need to protect what mattered most, and what mattered most was her. Emma kissed him and said they had won, they had survived, and Victor said they had done more than survive. They had built something real in the middle of chaos, had found love in a contract marriage, had proven in that trust and partnership could overcome any obstacle, and now they had the rest of their lives to figure out what came next. And for the first time since he had lost his sight, Victor felt like he could see clearly, could see a future with Emma that was bright and full of possibility, and that was worth more than any empire. 6 months after Antonio's arrest, Emma stood in the renovated study that had once been a crime scene and was now her favorite room in the estate, filled with medical textbooks and Victor's business files and photographs of their life together, and she couldn't believe how much had changed. How a contract marriage born from desperation had transformed into the kind of love story she'd only read about in novels. Victor's sight had partially returned through experimental surgery, funded by the family's legitimate medical research division. He could see shapes and shadows and light now, could make out Emma's face when she stood close, and he said the first thing he'd seen clearly in months was her smile, and it had been worth every moment of darkness to appreciate that gift. The family had restructured completely under Victor's leadership, divesting from questionable enterprises and focusing on legitimate businesses in real estate, technology, and healthcare. And while some old guard members had resisted the changes, most had embraced the opportunity to build something they could be proud of, something their children wouldn't have to hide or defend. Emma had returned to nursing part-time at the hospital where she'd worked before the marriage, but now she also ran a free clinic funded by the Moretti Family Foundation, providing health care to underserved communities. And Victor said watching her work with patients was like watching someone fulfill their destiny. She glowed with purpose and compassion. James had accepted a reduced role in the organization as penance for his betrayal, but had proven his loyalty repeatedly. And he'd reconnected with his sister and her children, who were now under permanent family protection, and sometimes Emma saw him playing soccer with his nephew in the estate gardens, and felt grateful that forgiveness was possible even after terrible mistakes. Lucia had become Victor's closest advisor and had started dating a federal prosecutor she'd met during Antonio's trial, and Sophia had gotten engaged to a kind accountant who made her laugh, and the state that had once felt like a prison now felt like a home, filled with people who'd chosen to be family rather than people trapped by blood obligation. Antonio was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security prison and had tried to orchestrate attacks on Victor from behind bars. But his remaining allies had abandoned him once his money and power disappeared. And the last Emma had heard, he spent his days writing bitter letters that no one read, a cautionary tale about what happened when ambition consumed everything else. Thomas Chen had relocated to California with his family under witness protection, and had sent Emma a Christmas card thanking her for giving him the courage to tell the truth. And his daughter was thriving in college studying criminal justice, determined to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Emma's mother's medical bills had been paid in full by the family foundation, and while her mother had passed away peacefully 3 months after the wedding, she'd lived long enough to see Emma truly happy, to meet Victor and tell him he'd better take care of her daughter or answer to a ghost. And Victor had promised solemnly that he would. The contract that had started everything sat framed in Victor's office now, a reminder of how far they'd come, how a business arrangement had evolved into partnership, and partnership had evolved into love. And sometimes Victor would touch the frame and say it was the best investment he'd ever made. Emma had learned to navigate the complex world of family politics and business negotiations, had discovered she had a talent for mediation and strategy, and Victor said she'd become his secret weapon in difficult meetings because people underestimated her kindness as weakness until she'd already won. Victor had learned to ask for help instead of shouldering everything alone, had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the foundation of real intimacy. And he told Emma regularly that losing his sight had been the catalyst for finally learning to see what mattered, to prioritize love over control and connection over power. They'd renewed their vows in a small ceremony 6 months after Antonio's conviction, this time with real promises and real commitment. And Emma had worn her mother's wedding dress, and Victor had cried when he saw the blurry white shape of her walking toward him. And Father Michael had said he'd known from the beginning they were meant for each other even if they hadn't known it themselves. Now Emma watched the sunset through the study window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and she felt Victor's arms wrap around her from behind, and he asked what she was thinking about, and she said she was thinking about beginnings, about how the worst moment of her life, her mother's diagnosis and the desperate contract, had led to the best thing that ever happened to her. Victor kissed her neck and said he'd been thinking about beginnings too, about how they'd started this journey as strangers bound by paper and desperation, and now they were partners bound by choice and love. And he wanted to know if she was ready for their next beginning. And Emma turned in his arms confused until she saw him holding a small velvet box. Victor opened it to reveal a ring, not the contract wedding band she still wore, but something new, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds. And he said this ring wasn't about obligation or agreements. It was about choosing her every day for the rest of his life, about building a future together that they both wanted. And would she marry him again? Really marry him, not as a business arrangement, but as the love of his life. Emma said yes through happy tears and kissed him as the sunset painted them both in gold. And she thought about how sometimes the best love stories started with contracts and ended with choices, started with desperation and ended with joy. And this was just the beginning of their forever, a forever they'd fought for and earned and would treasure every single day. And as Victor slipped the ring on her finger, Emma knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful in the light. And that was the greatest happy ending she could imagine.